In 18th century Europe, wearing the wrong floral shirt could lead to a prison sentence. In France, it was a crime punishable by execution. On the streets of London, mobs frequently attacked women to have this illegal fabric ripped right off their backs. The material was Indian chintz. While the word eventually became associated with cheap, mass-produced florals, the original hand-painted cotton was once the most disruptive economic force on the planet. This fabric arrived in European ports as a high-performance technology, triggering a global trade war that lasted for decades. To understand why empires were afraid of a floral pattern, you have to look at the European baseline. Their clothing was made of heavy wool and stiff linen. These fabrics were dull, difficult to wash, and their colors faded almost immediately. Then, traders began importing lightweight, brightly colored Indian cotton. This cotton possessed a technical advantage European manufacturers couldn't explain. Its colors didn't run or fade. In fact, they actually became more vibrant the more they were washed. This area chart shows textile sales during the late 17th century. As Indian cotton surged into the market, it began to systematically replace European wool and silk. The demand was so absolute that domestic manufacturers faced the total loss of their industries. Governments panicked. In 1721, King George I gave royal assent to the Second Calico Act, which prohibited the sale, wear, and household use of nearly all printed cottons. France and Spain had already issued their own absolute bans. Legal bans failed to stop the demand. A massive black market flourished across the continent, forcing European nations to realize that if they couldn't stop the imports, they had to learn how to manufacture the product themselves. Replication was nearly impossible because Indian artisans were operating with a 5,000-year-old mastery of empirical chemistry that European science couldn't match. The process relied on mordants, metallic salt solutions acting as chemical links, permanently locking organic dye to cotton fibers. Producing authentic chintz required up to 23 distinct steps, demanding the coordinated labor of 10 specialized craftsmen per piece. Indian artisans used a carved bamboo pen called a kalam to draw intricate outlines in iron and alum. They used wax resists to protect areas from indigo dye, and bleached the fabric using dung and sun exposure to achieve a high-contrast white background. This wasn't just decorative work, it was sophisticated chemical engineering that European manufacturers struggled to replicate for over a century. Out of desperation, nations resorted to industrial espionage. Spies, including French missionaries, were sent into Indian weaving centers to document the exact chemical sequences of the dye vats and smuggle those techniques back to Europe. Even with the stolen chemical formulas, a new problem emerged. European manual labor was too expensive. They couldn't pay workers to hand-paint fabric and still compete with the price of Indian imports. This economic deficit forced a shift toward automation. To bypass the cost of the human hand, inventors began developing machines like the spinning jenny to process raw cotton at a massive scale. Massive technological leaps followed. Factories replaced hand-painting with giant copper roller printers, and manual weaving was replaced by power looms churning out millions of yards of cotton. The urgent need to automate the production of chintz provided the initial economic pressure that built the factory system. With steam power and mechanical rollers, Europe could finally produce imitation chintz faster and cheaper than the original Indian artisans. Britain used its colonial power to flood the Indian market with these machine-made knockoffs, turning a former manufacturing powerhouse into a captive market for European goods. This graph shows the impact. As British machine textile exports rose exponentially, the traditional Indian handwoven industry collapsed, economically devastating the communities that had originally invented the craft. The mechanical innovations designed to replicate the results of Indian artisans ultimately provided the infrastructure used to economically dominate them. By the 20th century, the rejection of these foreign textiles became a central part of the fight for freedom. The Swadeshi movement turned the act of boycotting British cloth into a tool for national identity. Mahatma Gandhi urged Indians to burn their imported British knockoffs and spin their own cloth, or khadi, to reclaim their economic independence. The spinning wheel became a symbol of this resistance, a rejection of the European factory system in favor of indigenous heritage. Chintz was never just a floral pattern. It was a catalyst for global trade, a driver for mechanization, and eventually a focal point for a movement of national reclamation. The next time you see a printed textile, consider the millennia of chemistry behind it. Moving away from cheap industrial fashion to support independent artisans helps keep this world-shaping craft alive today.
Subscribe to us for more such videos.